Hi everybody, this is Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com, and today I'm looking at a 100 NL hand. In this particular hand I'm playing in the cutoff with a pair of queens, and fairly obviously I open raise to making this a pot sized bet, raising to 350. I get flat called by the player on the button and the two blinds fold, and we take a flop which is King of Hearts, Jack of Hearts, 10 of Spades. This obviously gives me, well, not second, it's second pair behind King X obviously, and I also have an open-ended straight draw and a backdoor flush draw. And in this situation I decided to check, because I think when the flop comes like this I like to have some quite fairly strong hands in my checking range. I don't want my checking range to be only hands like Ace X, 10-9, pair of fives, things like that, hands that, you know, have substantially missed the flop. I'd like to be able to check with some hands that, you know, can continue very happily on on turns and even rivers, as I think, you know, the check here encourages a lot of barreling from the villain on the button. So now, after I check, the villain does in fact bet the flop, $4, approximately half pot. I call, and then the turn blanks off with the 7 of clubs. I continue with the same strategy of checking, planning obviously to check call anything that the villain does. The villain does c-bet $10, which is I think about 60-65% pot, and again I think I have a fairly straightforward call here. And then there's an interesting spot on the river when the ace of clubs turns up, giving me the nuts. Now here I think I have three options. I think I can lead out with a very small bet, say around about quarter pot, just hoping to get called by a bluff catcher. I can lead out big, like maybe for a pot sized bet, again hoping to represent a busted draw and get called by a bluff catching hand, but you know, basically saying that I've got a much more polarized range. Or I could simply check and hope that the villain has some sort of marginal hand and decides to bluff themselves. Now, bearing in mind how the hand has played out, I couldn't see the villain betting here too often if I checked. I think the villain is quite likely to have some kind of two-pair hand here on the river, you know, a couple of broadways, or a, you know, an ace-10, ace-jack type hand, or maybe even ace-king is possible, although ace-king probably 3-bets pre-flop. But anyway, the main point is that I just don't think the villain is bluffing here too often. Also, I didn't really fancy leading out for a kind of pot-sized bet, because I just thought this is just like kind of like almost never getting called. The thing about having queens on the river is that, apart from anything else, I obviously block a lot of his Queen X holdings, which is a good thing, because it means that, you know, I'm very likely to, you know, not have to split the pot and take the whole pot down. But it also means he has less kind of 10 queen, jack queen, king queen in his range. So this is why I think he has a lot of two-pair hands. And I think these two-pair hands might just about call a small bet. So I decided to bet out quarter pot with $9 on the river, just hoping for a, you know, a crying call from some kind of two-pair hand. And he did in fact call, and he showed up with an unexpectedly weak hand with the king-9 of spades, which he shouldn't really be calling with, I don't think, pre-flop. I think he should maybe 3-bet that occasionally, but fold it most of the time. So let's now see what Snowy has to say about all this. Obviously Snowy is not going to have a problem with my open raise. Snowy doesn't obviously like the call from the button, but there's nothing unexpected about that. And then when we take the flop and I check, Snowy's not happy with this at all, and Snowy actually thinks, although he thinks checking is only marginally worse than actually betting, he wants to bet here 100% of the time, which I find a little bit surprising. So again, I know this is a situation where I'll be interested to hear John's opinion, because this to me looks like a pretty good hand to have in your checking range. But anyway, when the villain continues with a bet and we call, that's obviously fine, although Snowy now thinks you can raise here if you want to. When the turn comes and I decide to have the check call strategy, this is an instance where Snowy is happy about this. He doesn't seem to mind the villain's play either, and actually he's not happy about this, because when I call, he actually wants me to fold here, which again, this I find very surprising. He wants me to fold here 100% of the time, and I think I've quite underrepresented my hand by check calling the flop, and so I don't really see why I should be folding the turn here. I've obviously got outs even if I am behind, and he could very easily be barreling with a hand that's weaker than mine. So I'm puzzled by the fact that Snowy's quite adamant that I should be folding here. And then when we get the opportunity on the river to make something having suddenly turned the nuts, then Snowy doesn't like my play and wants to check 100% of the time. As I mentioned before, this is a play that I'm slightly puzzled by, because I think I'm almost never inducing the villain to bet here on the river, because the villain is so often going to have a kind of two-pair hand that has showdown value and simply wants to show down. And also, it may be something to do with this player pool, but I think I've played quite a lot of hands now in this player pool at this the Zoom NL100, and they will make these kind of crying calls on the river if you bet fairly small. Just to complete the Snowy analysis, Snowy doesn't like the villain calling here and wants to fold like virtually all the time with some kind of occasional raising. Okay, that's the hand. This has been Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com.
Hello, this is Jonathan Little, and pre-flop play is obviously fine for you. Your opponent should probably either be 3-betting or folding, but he decided to call. Flop comes King Jack 10, which is pretty good for the pocket queens. The reason Poker Snowy is, even though it suggests one player or the other, if you look at this, it's suggesting a small bet size, which would be about $2 into this pot, right? And what it's saying here is that if you bet $2, your opponent should be sticking around with all sorts of stuff that you have in pretty bad shape. Like your opponent could stick around with ace high. Your opponent could stick around with obviously any jack and any 10. Whereas if you check, you let various hands that have outs get there for free some portion of the time. Like say your opponent does have pocket threes and he's just never going to bluff at it. And he is also just never putting money in the pot unless he improves. So you just give that guy some free equity. Same thing if your opponent's sitting here with like ace 7 of clubs or something. I mean, if he has king 9 suited, he could probably have ace X suited, right? Those are hands that may not bet if you check to them. But if they get there, they improve. Well, only with the queen in this case, you're going to have to lose some money to them. So betting here is essentially a bet for value and protection, but it's mostly just for value when you bet this small. It's very important to make sure you're looking at the size that Snowy is suggesting. I imagine if you had to pick between 0.25 pot and pot, I bet if you clicked on the pot button, it would suggest that you check as opposed to potting it. That said, this is a spot where there are a decent amount of hands you don't mind protecting against, and there are also a lot of hands you can get value from. Also, if your opponent does have a hand like King Queen, he's probably not going to raise if you bet. Obviously, as King Jack or King 10, he may raise. So that's a really good reason not to bet, is if you think you're going to get raised a decent amount when either you're beat or your opponent has some draws. One cool thing about this, though, is you have the Queen of Hearts in your hand and also the Queen of Spades. So your opponent may not be inclined to bluff too often here, or semi-bluff too often here, because you block the straight draws, and you also block the flush draw and the backdoor flush draw to some extent. So there really shouldn't be very many draws in your range if your opponent raises. So I'm not exactly sure how Poker Snowy thinks about that kind of scenario, but it is worth mentioning. And with this hand, I would be more inclined to check than if you had Queen of Diamonds, Queen of anything else, basically. And non-Queen of Hearts. If you didn't have the Queen of Hearts, I would be more inclined to bet as well. But here you can very easily check call down on the flop in the turn, which is what happens. I think it's pretty easy. Call on the flop. Let's just rewind here just a second. I was going to say that on the turn, it's also a spot where leading may not be that terrible for the same reason as on the flop. Betting small is not that bad. Betting small on the turn is also, as you can see, it's relatively close in equity. But I just check every time because it's really hard to balance. When your opponent bets, I am also very surprised that Poker Snowy is suggesting folding. That said, if you do look at the equity, it is minimal, right? So why is it saying that folding is even a possibility? And I think the main reason here is because you have the Queen of Hearts in your hand. Because when you have the Queen of Hearts in your hand, what does a reasonable preflop calling range look like for your opponent? Well, first off, it's going to be hands like Ace Jack, maybe hands like King Jack, maybe hands like King 10 suiteds, maybe Queen 9 suited sometimes, maybe 9-8 suited. But if you go down the list of hands, you actually lose to almost every realistic hand that your opponent would bet the flop and then bet again on this turn. So, like, what are you beating? Would your opponent value bet ace-jack on the turn? Probably not, right? Would he bet ace-10 on the turn? Probably not. What about 10-9? I mean, maybe he's turning that into a bluff. What about queen-10? He probably isn't going to bet that. So it's kind of hard to come up with very many hands that your opponent could be betting here that you beat at this point, unless they're just running a stone bluff. Now, people run stone bluffs, so I could certainly see that being the case, but it's kind of hard to come up with a realistic button calling range that does not just smash this board to the point where you're behind a lot of the time at the moment. And if you're behind a lot of the time at the moment, you just have to look at your pot odds plus implied odds. And here, let's say you're 20-ish% to improve on the river and you're getting nowhere near those pot odds. So that's why it's suggesting to fold. And you have to even factor in, can you get paid on an ace or a 9 river? Because those are obviously very scary for whatever your opponent has if he doesn't have a straight. So, interesting spot where I'm virtually never folding as well when I've checked the flop for the same reason you cited. Your hand should be somewhat underrepresented, and worst case scenario, you have some equity, but it's kind of a cool spot where you really do lose to almost everything. So, that's neat. On the river, you decide to lead, and Poker Snowy does suggest check. And the reason I imagine it's suggesting a check here is because it's very, very easy for your opponent to just have a queen and never ever fold. Not thinking about your hand, right? It's more so thinking about your opponent's hand. If he's sitting here with a hand like, well, king 9, he should basically never call if you bet, so he's not going to pay you there. What if he has jack 10, which is another somewhat likely hand? Will he call if you bet? Well, probably shouldn't. So really, he should only call here on the river with perhaps like ace jack or better, and that's a relatively small combination of hands, or number of combinations. So what that means, well, you're often going to find spots like this on the river where you have the nuts, and there are some potential bluffing hands, like if you had some random flush draw, like ace-x of hearts, maybe you want to bluff this river, but even then you probably don't, right? Because you're trying to get your opponent to fold 2 pair. So it's an interesting spot where you should not have much of a bluffing range in my mind, although maybe you do. That said, in your analysis, you mentioned that you find that most people don't fold 2 pair in the spot to a small bet. And that could certainly be true in these games. And if that's the case in these games against these specific opponents, then sure, bet small. I mean, that's not a spot where Snowy's going to suggest you make a play based on exploiting the player pool, right? That's not really what Poker Snowy does. Poker Snowy assumes your opponents are going to play great and suggests a play based on that. And here, Snowy definitely does not recommend that your opponent calls with the king 9. I mean, let's just move forward a little bit, see what it says. Yeah, so you see here that it says, well, actually, kind of interesting. It says that call is not the worst play ever. And the reason for that is probably because it assumes you're leading somewhat balanced on the river. And it assumes that when you bet small, maybe you have some small number of bluffs in your range, like 25% bluffs or something like that. So kind of cool. I typically make these leads on the river in spots like this with hands that basically this exact situation that you laid out here. When I think my opponent's going to check back a lot of the 2 pairs, but will also call me if I lead whenever I have my hand, then I like the bet size. I typically just use a bigger bet size, though. Notice you did about 25% pot. I usually go a little bit bigger, something like half pot, maybe sometimes 2/3 pot, because a lot of players who are going to hero call, they're going to hero call regardless what bet size you make, as long as it's somewhere near reasonable. And I think a lot of people look at a quarter pot bet and a half pot bet as almost the same, even though they're clearly not. And if you can get an additional amount of value out of it, if you can get an extra $9 worth of value here, I think it's going to be pretty significant in the long run. So I typically don't use very many of these tiny river sizings, although here you just don't have very many bluffs, right? If you think about your range, you have almost no bluffs. Therefore, you should lead small to try to give your opponent as good of pot odds as possible. So I certainly get the small bet size, but in game, again, trying to exploit somewhat weak opponents who are going to make very, very light calls, you can typically bet a little bit larger and eke out a little bit more value. So cool hand. This has been Jonathan Little for dnbpoker.com. Thanks for watching.